Okay, so I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Nicky Green, who's going to talk to us about the American signal crayfish and whether it's a losing battle or whether there's hope against this non-native invasive species. So over to you, Nicky. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Kieran. I'll just dive straight into it. First of all, I'm just going to have a quick description of who I am and what I do. I've been working with crayfish for about 20 years. I've been a freelance crayfish specialist since 2015, and my thing really is about trying to find simple, cost-effective ways of controlling signal crayfish and reducing their impacts. I've also done quite a lot of white clawed crayfish work since about 2003, a lot of monitoring in Devon, and I've worked on a few conservation projects. I've been involved in captive breeding and arc sites and things like that. I've done my PhD was on signal crayfish control. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on, and that was with Exmoor National Park. So I've been doing a lot of work with them on all sorts of aspects of signal crayfish since 2015. I've also do quite a lot of training. I run a training course called All About Crayfish with a colleague, Jen Nightingale from Bristol Zoo, and we run this course every year. I also do lots of ad hoc training for volunteer groups and organisation staff and things like that. What I'm going to cover in the talk today, I'm going to talk about the life history, the ecology of the signal crayfish. I'm going to talk about their impacts, the ways that have been tried to control them, and finishing up with a couple of case studies where we have had perhaps a little bit of success or some interesting results. So first of all, briefly, where did these crayfish come from? So signal crayfish, Pacifastacus leniusculus, they originate in the northwest USA, southwest Canada. The ones we have came via Scandinavia in the mid-70s. And it was really the UK government thought that it could be a commercial venture to diversify farming and to create another income stream. And partly because in Scandinavia, they are a really popular traditional foodstuff. And as you can see from the photos, people tend to eat mountains of crayfish and wear silly hats and drink vast quantities of alcohol. So, you know, what's not to like? So crayfish were introduced into around 300 sites in the late 70s, rivers, lakes, ponds. They encouraged farmers to dig ponds on their land and put crayfish in them. The commercial venture, the food market, never really took off, and in the meantime all the crayfish escaped and spread over pretty much all of England, most of Wales, and they're now covering a fair bit of Scotland as well now. And as the signal crayfish advanced, the native white clawed crayfish decreased for various reasons, which I will go into in a few moments. First of all, I just want to clarify what we're actually talking about. I've seen from the chat that sounds like a lot of you have some experience of crayfish and have encountered crayfish through your work or through your hobbies. So the signal crayfish, it's called a signal crayfish because of these whitish patches on the upper side of the claws, and you can see that in the bottom left and the top right photographs. Our native white clawed crayfish, which is the center photograph and the top left, doesn't have these white claws, and it's quite knobbly on its claws, whereas the signal crayfish is pretty smooth throughout. The other difference is the white clawed crayfish has these whitish, orangey, beige undersides to its claws, which is the top left photograph, whereas the signal crayfish, bottom right, has this sort of brick red underside to the claws. There are a couple of other diagnostics, but I won't go into that now. So we're talking about the guys with the blobs on the claws. Life history. So all crayfish are decapod crustaceans. So the majority of them have 8 legs and 2 claws. There's about 650 species of crayfish globally. Signal crayfish can live up to 16 years, but it's generally more sort of 6 to 9 is more normal in the wild. They can get to about 250 mil length, so that is quite big. The one I'm holding in that top photo there, that's about half that size. So you can imagine what a foot-long crayfish will look like. They grow via molting, as all crustaceans do. They're described as voracious, omnivorous, and exploratory. So they eat anything, they eat lots of it, and they like traveling. So they're the perfect invader, if you like. They're mainly nocturnal, but you do see them out and about during the day, particularly the larger ones, which are less worried about being predated by something during the daytime. And they're more active in summer than in winter. They don't hibernate, but they tend to sort of tuck themselves away and become fairly inactive. Though you can catch them all year round, but generally you get much lower catches in the winter. Signal crayfish mate in around the last 2 weeks of October, and the female will carry the eggs, which is sort of 100 to 400, depending on the size and the health of the animal, on the underside of her abdomen. And they carry them through the winter, and then they hatch between March and June, and the eggs will hatch, and then the young crayfish will molt twice, actually still in situ on the underneath of the crayfish. You'll see from the bottom photograph there. And when they're fully formed little tiny crayfish, then they will disperse, and then they'll be completely independent after that. Signal crayfish are also very good invaders because they tolerate a wide range of environmental conditions. So they can deal with acidic waters, such as on Dartmoor and Exmoor in the southwest. They can also tolerate brackish water. We recently had a report of them in Portishead Marina at Bristol, which is pretty concerning. They're more tolerant of things like pollution and high levels of silt and stuff like that. So overall, quite a tough cookie. So I'm moving on to the impacts of signal crayfish now. And the predominant impact that they've had on native white clawed crayfish is the crayfish plague, Aphanomyces astaci, which is a fungal pathogen. And so they carry this disease, but they're not susceptible to it. But it will kill off masses of white clawed crayfish. Within a few days of contact, you lose entire populations. And the photograph there is a die-off in Ireland from a loch where several million crayfish were killed in a matter of days. Other impacts are general ecosystem impacts. So as I said, they're omnivorous, so they have the potential to have impacts at several levels in the food chain. So macrophytes, detritus, invertebrates, fish, also other crayfish. They're quite predatory, so they will catch and kill small fish such as salmon fry, trout fry, bullhead, etc. They also quite cannibalistic, and they eat they will eat other crayfish, including their own species, and they will predate and kill white clawed crayfish as well. Then there's all these sort of indirect impacts as well by competing with other fauna for food and shelter. The bottom quite nice photo is a bullhead in its nest guarding its eggs. So, you know, your signal crayfish will come along and probably kill and eat the bullhead, then he'll eat the eggs, and then he'll have a bit of a snooze in what was left of the nest. That's the sort of impacts they can have. Signal crayfish are also ecosystem engineers. They have a habit of burrowing into bankside habitats, and some estimates say about a release of 3 tons of sediment per kilometre of burrows. And this causes bank collapse, which then obviously releases sediments into the water body. And if you're talking about rivers, it will widen the river and slow down the flow, and then cause increased sediment in the river, with obviously knock-on effects on things like spawning gravels and invertebrate habitat and such like. And it's also been shown that their activities, just living, so sort of walking around looking for food, meeting each other, having a fight, killing each other, killing other things, all sorts of stuff like that, causes release of sediment, which is then taken up into the water column and moved around, and that has been shown to actually cause flooding in some really bad instances. So moving on to control now. My pessimistic viewpoint, as you can see from the first comment, is it's generally expensive, time-consuming, and potentially futile. And I think that is the fact. You know, we don't have any kind of effective ways of dealing with signal crayfish, but I keep trying things. I keep seeing what we can do that might help, and it's really an ongoing research project. And we're talking about control. We're not talking about eradication. We're not talking about killing every single crayfish in a population, because that's really only can be done either by using biocide chemicals or by destroying the habitat completely. So, for example, you know, dewatering a pond and then filling it in, you know, just get rid of that complete habitat, which obviously, you know, you lose the habitat as well as getting rid of the crayfish. So not ideal. Control and containment is something that is pursued, even though, you know, it's a long-term effort, because eradication is not possible at this time, but also because it does have a reduction in the impacts. So, you know, you can reduce the effects of burrowing or the effects of predation and things like that, and give the rest of the system a chance to continue. A key point is you need to target all life stages of the crayfish population, and I'm going to talk more about that later. And the other point is that all the methods that we try at the moment, most of them have limitations, either in perhaps the size of crayfish targeted or the type of water body that it is effective on. So it's really important to be able to have, if you like, a toolbox of different methods that you can apply, and to be able to adapt. So if one thing doesn't work, you know, be able to sort of have a go at using something else. And also, I think a good way of approaching it is to see if you can use natural processes that might save you time and money. So that might be you know, natural occurring things in the river, such as barriers, or it could be predators or something like that. Again, I'll be talking about that as we go through. Before I start talking about methods, my number one message is biosecurity. You know, very, very important. If you don't have crayfish, take every measure you can to prevent them from coming in. So outreach, press, you know, really pushing messages such as check, clean, dry. If you remember my previous slide on crayfish plague and the big die-off in Ireland, there are no signal crayfish in Ireland. There are many, many outbreaks of plague in Ireland, and the disease is carried there by dirty fishing equipment. So it is so important to clean your equipment, check for predator, you know, check for crayfish or any other invasive species, and you know, try and stop these things from being spread around. Another key point that I want to mention before I go on to control methods is going back to this idea that you need to target all sizes in a population, or all life stages of a population. I imagine quite a few of you in the audience have seen a signal crayfish, and I can guess it's probably, it might have been about that big, maybe 4 to 6 inches long. So animals that size are less than 5% of any crayfish population. As you can see from this graph, 80% of any crayfish population is less than about 40 mil long. So you're talking, you know, that big. And that's what we need to target. And they're really hard to catch. So, you know, it's not an easy situation. Right, moving on to control methods now. So the most commonly used control method is removing the crayfish physically, and mainly this is done through trapping. So we have the conventional funnel trap baited traps, which is the bottom right hand photograph, which is you put bait in, you leave them overnight and you check them and remove the crayfish. Then you have artificial refuge traps, which is a method that I've been working on and developing for the last sort of 15 years. And this is my kind of go-to trapping method. They're a lot less labor intensive, and they're suitable for sort of shallow rivers and a wider variety of watercourses and locations. Other methods that you can use are fyke nets, other types of nets. There are habitat-based attractants, such as brash bundles, and I'm going to be talking about that in one of my case studies. The other thing you can do is you can just physically catch crayfish, like the guys are doing in that top photograph, by looking under stones, also things like kick sampling. The problem with all of these capture methods is they are often either size or sex biased. And this can lead to what we call density dependent effects. So that basically means you take out all the big ones because they're cannibalistic and aggressive. You end up getting a higher survival rate of the smaller crayfish, and that can sort of scupper your attempts at removing the crayfish, because you're basically allowing the younger animals that perhaps wouldn't have survived to have a greater chance of survival. So 2 other methods that have been trialed are electrofishing and dewatering, either on their own or in combination. They really only work well on small water courses where you have relatively shallow water for obvious reasons. And they're pretty labor intensive, but both systems have been found to be, you know, up to 80–90% effective, especially if repeated regularly. Of course, the problem is that you would have to kind of repeat that every now and again, because you won't get every single animal. You need fish rescues prior to carrying out the works. You need agreement, consent from the Environment Agency. And there are potential non-target impacts, so impacts on things like invertebrates, perhaps. So, but it does have potential, particularly if you have a small watercourse where you might be, you might have a recently established or a very small population. So, one to consider in a specific situation. Barriers are a method which is really about the containment of signal crayfish rather than the control of signal crayfish. So it's specifically really to prevent them from expanding upstream. And one of my case studies is looking at this. So barriers can be a natural barrier, for example, like a waterfall or a rapid, a cascade, for example. There could be an accidental barrier. So the culvert down in the right-hand bottom corner is an accidental barrier. So this barrier has been found to prevent crayfish from moving upriver at a site in Leicestershire. And a team of scientists from Switzerland have done some research into what makes an effective signal crayfish barrier. And what they've found is, surprisingly, exactly what that culvert has, which is a vertical drop, an overhanging lip, and a permanent velocity of a particular speed, 0.65 cubic meters per second. And so they've been designing a range of different barriers which fit this bill, and they've been trialing them in Switzerland. There are potentially some indirect impacts, so things like migratory fish, smaller fish, perhaps benthic fish that may not migrate, the impacts on a barrier in the middle of a population, for example, potential sedimentation, etc. So it's an area that's being developed, but probably needs a bit more knowledge at the moment. The top right-hand photograph is what's called a crayfish reef, and this is a temporary barrier which has been set up to attract a large number of white-clawed crayfish for collection to take to an ark site. And I've got the idea of perhaps trying to trial this in a signal crayfish containment situation, and I've got a case study on that, so more on that later. Moving on to biocides, as I said, the only thing apart from completely destroying the habitat, which really has the capacity to completely eradicate a signal crayfish population. Very expensive to do. The chemicals are incredibly expensive and not very PC, I don't think. It's not something which is politically correct or seen to be, a good thing to do. Clients that I have worked with are definitely not really interested at all. I think there's a perception of what will the public think, and there are risks, obviously, but the least risky chemicals are the pyrethroid-based insecticides, and whatever you use, there will be short-term impacts on other fauna, such as invertebrates, amphibians, etc., and you'd have to do what you could to rescue fish, and at least prior to applying the treatment. There's a risk of downstream impacts as well, particularly if you're attempting it in a watercourse. Researchers found that the best successes are in smallish still water sites, so less than 2.5 hectares, and small streams. There are several things that can affect the efficacy of the chemical. So the type of substrate, what it's made of, the structure, the number of burrows, the number of crayfish burrows that are present, and whether you can actually get the chemical in those burrows. the amount of vegetation cover, the type of vegetation cover, the pH of the water, temperature of the water, they all have impacts on the effectiveness of the chemical. Now, this one is potentially going to be the silver bullet in the future. So the guys at the Roslin Institute in the University of Edinburgh, who brought us the famous Dolly the sheep, they've been working with a gene drive technology called CRISPR. And what it can do is you can modify an individual animal and to have a trait that is inherited by its offspring. So you can modify a crayfish to produce single sex offspring, for instance, or perhaps infertile offspring. And that will go down through the generations of the population, and it's being trialed on grey squirrels at the moment, and they are confident that it can be done on signal crayfish, but it is a long way off. I would say probably 10 years away, but that could be the answer to our problem in 10 years' time. Fingers crossed. Moving on to working with natural processes, we have predators. So lots of things eat crayfish, including things like kingfisher and otters, but they're not really the key things that will have the impacts that we're looking for in terms of predating signal crayfish to a control situation. So the best predators are eel and perch, and probably pike as well. And so those are the kind of key fish that we think about when we're thinking about what can have an impact on signal crayfish. And I'll be talking about that a bit in one of my case studies later. Now, the other technique that has been trialed, and this is the subject of my PhD research, is sterile male release technique. And the rationale for attempting this is based on their hierarchical society and the way that they dominate the breeding behavior and the way they're cannibalistic towards the younger animals. So we thought that sterilizing and returning the large males would have a good impact on reducing the breeding success and maintaining the cannibalism and the suppression of the smaller animals. So the research basically involved 7 years of weekly trapping and sterilization on the River Barle on Exmoor. And we also did lots of lab experiments looking at whether the sterilization was effective in mating and brood size, whether the process actually involved any kind of constraints to the behavior of the males or the choice of the females, things like that. And what we found that our capture rates did decrease by 60% over the 7-year period, which implied that the population had been reduced, but we couldn't find any evidence to attribute it to the sterilization of the males. We didn't have any kind of major reductions in the number of small crayfish that we were catching or in the brood sizes of the females that we captured. I'm not going to go into this in any massive detail, but my thesis and 3 papers that I wrote are available online, and they're going to be in the blog that comes with this talk. So this and all other kind of bits of research that I've mentioned, links to that will be available to you. Right, we're on to our 2 case studies now. So this is number 1. This is a site owned by the National Trust, Prior Park Landscape Gardens in Bath. It consists of 3 ornamental lakes built in the 18th century, and it includes a Palladian bridge, and there are only 4 of those in the world. So the top photograph, you've got the bridge, and in the foreground, in front of that bridge, is what we call the top lake. Then behind the bridge, and as you can see dried out, is the middle lake. This was drained in 2015, 2016, but you can see it's still got rivulets running through it, and it's quite densely vegetated, so it's quite moist. And then the large lake in the background at the top is what we call the lower lake or the bottom lake. So that's what we're talking about when I go top, middle, bottom. And there was signal crayfish introduced into these lakes in the 1990s, we think probably with angling activities. So there are also fish in the lakes. And the signal crayfish started burrowing into the historic 18th century dams, which were in danger of collapsing and destroying the entire site, which is grade 1 listed. So a very important site. And so they took on a very expensive project to fix this, so to repair the dams. And the bottom lake was drained, and all the fish from that lake were captured and moved into the top lake. And trapping started in 2019 at both of the bottom and top lakes, and then continued, has since then in the top lake, and then recommenced in 2022 after the works had been completed and the 2 lakes refilled. So this is what happened. So we trapped through the top lake all the way through from 2019 till now, apart from between March and August 2020, when during lockdown of the pandemic. And you can see prior to January 2020, very high catch rates. And January 2020, we hoiked all the fish out of the bottom lake, put them in this lake, 320 tench, 235 perch, 24 roach, and 2 bream. And as you can see, the catch rates declined rapidly and have stayed low ever since. Now, in March 2023, this was after the 2 other lakes had been repaired and refilled. We knew that there were still crayfish in both of those lakes. There was nothing done to remove them prior to the works commencing. And so we knew that there were crayfish still hanging around, surviving in the damp conditions in the lakes. So I was very, very keen to get the fish redistributed so that the predation effects could be applied to all 3 lakes. So in March 2023, we caught all of the fish from the top lake, which turned out to be 180 perch and 400 roach, which is very interesting because roach are quite tough creatures. They're not renowned for their ability to predate crayfish, but they have done extremely well in that lake, which is full of crayfish and not much else. So that's a very interesting thing that we're going to be looking at in the future. But anyway, we caught 580 fish from the top lake in March 2023, and we redistributed them. So there was 240 fish in each lake, and only 100 went back into this lake. So the population of fish in this lake has gone down by 500. So we're going to be watching this space and see whether that is enough of a population of fish to maintain this kind of control effect. In the top and middle lake, the big headline is, after we refilled the middle lake, which had been drained since 2016, we caught 700 crayfish. far more than the lower lake. And you can imagine why this may have happened. So the lower lake, when it was drained, a lot of crayfish probably moved overland into the middle lake to get away from the works and the draining procedure. And also, when we put the fish in the top lake, I can imagine that quite a few crayfish could have left that lake and gone into the middle lake to avoid predation. But it was a very surprising result. We were not expecting that number of crayfish. The other interesting thing here is you see the left-hand bar for the top lake, and we're catching almost predominantly large crayfish in the top lake. And that shows us the effects of the predators, because predators will eat the small fish the small crayfish that are really, really hard to catch. So that is why they're such valuable tools or friends, colleagues in our fight against crayfish. So that's really good evidence that the predation is changing the structure of the population. I forgot to say what we're doing now. Well, I'm in the process of writing a 5-year management plan. So we're going to be continuing with the removing of crayfish and monitoring the numbers. We're going to be monitoring the fish numbers. We're going to be looking out for spawning, evidence of spawning, hoping that our crayfish are going to be continue to be predated by expanding healthy fish populations. We're also going to be hopefully looking at the roach in particular to see what their role is, doing things like gut content analysis, hopefully, and seeing how good they are as a predator, because they're a very tough, hardy fish that survives in a range of conditions. So if they're shown to be a good predator, then that's very positive news. Right, this is my second and final case study. I have no idea how much time I've used up, so I'll just keep going. And so this is all about Exmoor. They're regionally important rivers on Exmoor for Atlantic salmon. So Atlantic salmon are in catastrophic decline at the moment. That's the EA words, not mine. And these rivers are really important as spawning grounds for lots and lots of salmon. And they're also in the beautiful Exmoor landscape. You know, we don't want to see these rivers silty and full of burrows and bank collapses, which we have further downstream. And we don't want these areas full of signal crayfish. So I've come up with the idea of a thing called a containment zone, which is based on the crayfish reef that I talked about earlier, using a temporary barrier to basically slow or stop upstream migration. And the idea is that we build these barriers across the river under the water flow, so just on the bed, so it doesn't impede the flow or cause flooding or anything like that, and stop, it won't stop animals from moving up and downstream over it, but it will attract large numbers of crayfish. That's the idea. And then teams of wonderful volunteers will go along regularly and dismantle these features and remove all the crayfish. And then we'll be monitoring it upstream to gauge success. So this has been a project which started in 2022. And first of all, we established the upstream extent of our two populations that we're interested in, with using ARTs, artificial refuge traps, to trap intensively every week to get an idea of how far up these crayfish had gone. And then the following year, we wanted to sort of do a bit of an experiment to see what methods would be best, what features would be best to form these containment zones. So we trialed a range of different types of ARTs, as you can see bottom photograph. So standard ones, large capacity ones, baited ones, ones targeted at juveniles using small pipes. And then we trialed 3 types of habitat traps as well, which is the 3 photos on the right. So we have the Pritchard trap, which is top right. This is a kind of a quadrat type trap, which is buried in the substrate. Then we had brash bundles made of birch cuttings. And then we had bracken bundles, which is copying a method used in New Zealand by the Maoris to catch native crayfish over there. So we trialed all these methods fortnightly rather than weekly. And the results we had were the habitat traps were massively more successful than the ARTs, as you can see from these graphs, particularly the brash bundles, which were absolutely fantastic at attracting large numbers of crayfish. And within the ARTs, the higher capacity traps were better than the standard size traps, which kind of makes sense because they're much bigger. But we also found them a bit cumbersome to use on the river. I've previously been trialing them in reservoirs, so on a river they were quite tricky to empty when you're standing in 3 foot of water, trying to hold on to several buckets and not get drowned. And we also found that the catch rates were higher despite emptying the traps less frequently. So we found that, you know, a fortnightly site visit is just as effective as a weekly site visit, which is very good. And we also looked at the kind of a time and motion study, so the number of volunteers and the amount of time taken to empty the habitat traps was the same as emptying all the ARTs, so it was also pretty time effective too. The other thing we found out about the brash bundles was that they caught mostly small-sized crayfish. Again, we're really interested in catching small crayfish because they're really hard to catch. They also caught quite good numbers of medium crayfish, but another very exciting thing was that they attracted very large numbers of elvers, young eel. Eel are really good crayfish predators, and they are in decline. And one of the reasons that they are in decline is lack of this kind of habitat. So by putting these brash bundles into the rivers, we are providing eel habitat, but we're also able to remove crayfish. So it's really a kind of a double win in terms of crayfish control, because you're removing lots of crayfish, but you're encouraging a major predator. So that was really, really interesting and encouraging. We also found that the ARTs caught mostly medium-sized crayfish. Again, that's good. So we've covered our small crayfish, we've covered our medium crayfish. So we just need to figure out a good way of removing large crayfish, and then we're targeting everyone we want to target. So the plan for next year, if we get funding, we should hear today whether we get funding, which is a bit nerve-wracking. We're going to set up 2 of these containment zones, and we're going to figure out, we've got an idea of the type of materials we're going to put in them. We're going to figure out how to empty them, the best time of emptying them, and we're going to monitor them and see if they work or not. So that's it, I think. Yes, thank you very much for listening. And yeah, let's move on to the questions.